oil bubbled here 100 years ago, great hopes were attached to it. For the first time in the Middle East, modern treasure hunters were rewarded in Iran. Today, a busy road connects the Gulf Coast with Mazit Suleiman, a small market town which also lies at the center of large oil fields. Since antiquity, oil and gas sputtered to the Earth's surface here. In 1902, the traces of black gold in the Valley of Oil lured English oil investors to the remote and barren Karst mountain range. Mules and camels had to haul tools and building materials from the coast to the heart of the province Khuzestan. Blistering heat, lack of water, and the hostility of the local nomads couldn't discourage the oil pioneers. Head of the English expedition was the tough, legendary Scottish engineer George Reynolds. The first oil rigs built with primitive means only yielded disappointments. For years, no profitable oil well was struck. In London, the financiers slowly became impatient. They were beginning to run out of money. Above all, William Knox D'Arcy, a speculator and adventurer who had made a fortune with gold mines in Australia. When Shah Muzaffar al-Din offered him a concession for black gold in Persia, he jumped at the opportunity. The Shah was in desperate need of money, and in 1901 sold the Englishman an oil concession for £40,000. He spent huge amounts of money on his extensive luxury travels to Europe. London was concerned. She considered the Mid-East region to be part of the British sphere of interests, from which she could secure access to the gateway to India. The British government asked the Scottish Burma Oil to help D'Arcy out.
I regret to say that oil brought only ill to our country. The oil contract between Persia and Britain, or rather with a British company in 1901, was signed at a time in which two large imperial powers were ruling our country. One can say that, at the time, almost all the large economic sectors of the country were either under the control of Britain or of Russia. The two countries were rivals. Russia, as later the Soviet Union, were intent on ruling Iran alone, as plans show that only came to light later on.
قصدش این بود که در مجموع با طرح‌هایی که بعداً روشن شد کل ایران رو بهش مسلط بشه.
Power politics also played a role in the search for oil. In the eyes of the British, Russia, which had already occupied northern Persia, had to be pushed back and her advance to the Indian Ocean prevented. In the 7th year of their trial drillings, Reynolds and his men still fought against the unbearable heat and the perils of engineering. On the other hand, the financiers D'Arcy and Burma Oil were broke. In a letter dated the 14th of May 1908, Reynolds was asked to shut down the operations. The delivery of the letter, however, took weeks. In the early morning hours of May the 25th, after an especially hot night, the on-site security force was awakened by the noise of an oil fountain rising high above the oil rig. Oil had been found in Persia. Several days later, in a triumphant telegram, the British Chargé d'Affaires in Tehran informed the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, about the discovery of oil. Reynolds' dismissal was reversed. London now intensified its efforts to consolidate its influence in Persia. The south was sparsely populated. Here the nomad clan of the Bakhtiari ruled, which refused to yield to the Shah's powers. The clan signed its own contracts with the British, who needed access to oil. As early as 1907, London was in a position to close a contract with Moscow about the partitioning of Persia into spheres of interest. A southern British, a northern Russian, and a neutral buffer zone in between. Many inhabitants of the southern provinces still identify as Bakhtiari, and some of them still live as nomads who get by with the little they always had, their flocks of sheep. Even close to the oil fields, as here in Masjid Suleiman, they pitch their tents.
In fact, 5 important clans lived in this area. All of them were under the control of the British, and the oil fields were in this region too. Britain was convinced that this territory also belonged to them, as the local rulers did business with them. After the oil contract had been signed, one of the first things the British did, in 1905, was to negotiate a contract with the Bakhtiari, without the Persian government being involved at all. From now on, the oil company was an independent government within Persia. Without regard for the Shah in Tehran, the British company concluded contracts with the nomad clans.
Great Britain saw her power threatened by the German Reich, which challenged the navy with a fleet of battleships. Winston Churchill, at the time First Lord of the Admiralty, pressed for the English dreadnoughts to be converted from coal to oil combustion. In future, the ships had to be faster than the Germans, which ran on coal. In Istanbul, the Germans belatedly joined the race for oil. Turkey asked the friendly German Reich for the construction of the Baghdad Railroad, so she could access her Arabian province, Mesopotamia. Later, it was to be built all the way to Basra at the Persian Gulf. In Mesopotamia, the later Iraq, one expected to find rich oil resources. The Kaiser, who had himself portrayed in an Ottoman Pasha uniform, gave top priority to the construction of the railroad. The satirical newspaper, the Lustigen Blätter, ridiculed the imperialistic project, paved the way for German cultural activities in the Orient. German financial interest for the project was never publicly disclosed. Only when the Kaiser exerted pressure did the Deutsche Bank agree to provide financing. Despite enormous technical difficulties, the construction of the railroad made good progress. During World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, however, forced a stop to construction work. Baghdad was still far away. Led by the famous Lawrence of Arabia, Arabian guerrillas blew up rail segments over and over again. In Persia, the English were faster. With the help of only a single pipeline, they were able to transport the oil from Masjid Suleiman to the coast. Over a stretch of 200 kilometers, the pipes had to be laid through 2 rocky hilly ranges and a broad desert plain. As roads, lines and bridges were non-existent, this could almost only be achieved by sheer muscle power, and with the help of thousands of horses, mules and camels. Only in the more flat terrain, tractors could be used. In the summer of 1912, after 1.5 years, the pipeline reached Abadan, where the first loading port and the first refinery on the Persian Gulf were constructed. Oil could now set out to conquer the world, just in time to play a major role in World War I. Oil was the blood of victory. At first at sea, where the German coal-fueled fleet was inferior to the British fleet. Mechanization advanced at a breathtaking speed. Also on land and in the air, in the midst of the war, the British invented the tank, which in the end would be decisive for the trench warfare at the Western Front. On both sides, tens of thousands of trucks and thousands of aeroplanes were built during the war years. The German Reich, which only received limited amounts of oil from Romania, collapsed due to shortage of oil. 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British, together with their Arab allies, drove the Turks out of Mesopotamia. The war had confirmed Churchill's point of view. Without oil, a great nation could not survive. At his behest, the British state, by an Act of Parliament, strengthened their shares in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. After the war, petrol and oil consumption multiplied. At the assembly line, Henry Ford built his Tin Lizzie, the first people's car. The era of the car had begun. Now the British were determined to also bring the oil fields of Mesopotamia under their control. France pursued the same goal in the part of Mesopotamia she had conquered. In London, Prime Minister Clemenceau met his colleague Lloyd George to discuss their respective interests. Both aspired a mandate by the League of Nations in Geneva for their part of the former Turkish province, for Syria and for Iraq. As both had already shown military presence in the region, the League of Nations agreed. It was the beginning of Part 2 of European oil imperialism. The British assigned an exceptional woman, Gertrude Bell, to fulfill the League of Nations mission to build up a sovereign state in Iraq during the time of the Mandate. An expert on the Orient out of Passion, who spoke perfect Arabic, she was present at all high-level talks, also participating in the discussions about border issues with the Saudi king Ibn Saud. At a conference in Cairo, she convinced the new British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Churchill, to withdraw from direct rule in Baghdad and agree to the establishment of a monarchy. The Khatun, the lady, was trusted by the sheiks, as she knew better than they where the borders of their clan territory ran. In a modest tone, she wrote to her mother on the 4th of December 1921.
One way or another, I think I've succeeded in compiling a reasonable frontier.
The Armenian oil merchant, Calouste Gulbenkian, helped the British consolidate their oil empire. Known as the incredibly rich Mr. 5%, he was a partner in the Turkish Oil Company, in which the Deutsche Bank also had a holding of 25% since pre-war times. But the German losers were now expelled. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which since 1914 also had a holding in the Turkish Oil Company, was now in charge. She accepted the French as the heirs to the German interest, but no American oil companies. Washington was up in arms against the British monopoly and demanded its own concession for Standard Oil as an alternative. Due to British pressure, Baghdad denied this request. Alan Dulles, the Near East representative at the State Department at the time, was a particularly persuasive advocate of an open-door policy. In the end, London yielded in favor of Standard Oil and its ruthless president Teagle. It needed American funds for the development of the Iraqi oil fields. Standard Oil took over the leadership of an American consortium, which was given a holding of almost 24%. The newly founded Iraq Oil Company was made up of 5 partners. The negotiations were only completed a few days before oil gushed out of the first oil well in Baba Gurgur, near Kirkuk, an area mainly inhabited by Kurds. In return for acting as intermediator, Gulbenkian was rewarded with 5% of the holding. As Mr. 5%, he became one of the richest men of his time. Gulbenkian now drew the red line on a large map of the Mideast, along the borders of the collapsed Turkish Empire, which obliged all associates not to single-handedly, and without informing the others, drill for oil in this region. As a result, Saudi Arabia was declared to be within Great Britain's sphere of interest. The British interests in Iraq were now administered by King Faisal I, who, after his coronation, was received by King George VI in London. As a Sunni Muslim and a member of the Hashemite dynasty, which had been expelled from Saudi Arabia, Faisal was disliked by many Iraqis, especially by the Shiites. He was regarded as a minion of the English oil imperialists, who could only rule with their military assistance.
When Gertrude Bell went to that country, those were structures that nobody else knew how to live other than through these structures. People thought of themselves as members of tribes. They were not members of a state. Their loyalty was not to a state. It was not to a city. It was to a tribe. And that tribe would move, and that tribe had relations with other tribes and so on. But those kinds of relations, social relations, have long since gone.
Near Baghdad, the British ran the air base Habania, which Iraqi insurgents, with the help of German Messerschmitts, had dared to attack in 1941. The German planes came from Syria, at the time still a colony of defeated France. The British effortlessly dealt with the attacks and the German warplanes. For the rest of the war, British troops stayed as occupation forces in Iraq. In the Suez Canal, the American cruiser Quincy was the setting for a surprising stopover by President Roosevelt on his way back home from Yalta. He met with the Saudi Arabian King Ibn Saud, who arrived with a large entourage on the Quincy. In February 1945, at the Conference of Yalta, post-war world order had been discussed. But Roosevelt had more in mind. He also wanted a new oil order. Roosevelt had singled out the king to play a special role in the fight for oil. In this scheme, the close ally Churchill only played a minor role. Disgruntled, he made a formal call on the Quincy. During the war, America had, through the Lend-Lease agreement, not only supplied 90% of the Allied oil and petrol needs, but had also delivered great amounts of war material. As a result, American citizens had to put up with petrol rationing. The oil scarcity was partly due to German submarines, who had successfully pursued US tank ships in the Atlantic until they had to yield to American superiority. Already in 1943, Washington was worried about the depletion of their oil resources and looked to Saudi Arabia, whose oil fields had hardly been touched during the war. Everett Lee de Golyer, who, as the discoverer of the Mexican oil fields, had become America's most famous oil explorer and geologist, was sent to Saudi Arabia as early as 1943 to create an overview of the country's oil wealth for himself. About his travels he made a film. Excerpts from it are shown here for the first time in public. His findings, which he reported to Washington only a few months later, were sensational. He predicted that in the future the Mideast would be the center of world oil production. In his report he also included Iran and Iraq, as well as Kuwait, Bahrain and Qatar, whose resources he also analyzed. Even in his most cautious estimates, he assumed that 25 billion barrels could be found in the region, 5 billion of them in Saudi Arabia. But in other estimates, he also held resources of 300 billion barrels, 100 billion barrels in Saudi Arabia alone, for possible. After encounters with poor and strictly religious locals, he recognized, with great foresight, the social and political impact which an oil boom in the region would have upon the people. He recommended letting them participate in it as much as possible. Roosevelt had been convinced by his Home Secretary, Harold Ickes, also responsible for oil policy, that he must declare Saudi Arabia to lie within the American area of interest. To the British ambassador in Washington he said,
The Persian oil is all yours. The oil in Iraq and Kuwait we will share. As to the Saudi oil, it belongs to us.
Roosevelt made it brutally clear to the British that he would not accept their claim to Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud's empire, at the time barely 20 years old, had emerged from a pact between the clan Saud and religion. In the 18th century, the Sauds had joined forces with the sect leader Abdul Wahhab, who preached a return to the Puritan belief of the Prophet Muhammad, and who called for jihad, for the holy war against the infidels. And Abdul Wahhab declared the Quran to be the constitution of the country. Ibn Saud was also a fervent Quran scholar and a strict Wahhabi, who was preparing to reconquer the Saud tribal area and the capital Riyadh, both of which had been lost in battle to the Jabal Shammah tribe neighboring to the north, and its rulers, the Al-Rashid family. The Bedouins in this region, in the Najd, a barren, dry and hot high plateau, were also strict Wahhabis and feared warriors. From their midst, Ibn Saud formed a powerful troop, the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan's heroic deeds and the recapture of Riyadh at the beginning of the 20th century are part of the Ibn Saud myth, shown here in Hollywood manner in a film produced by the Saudi oil company Aramco. The attack on the Rashids, who were allied with the unpopular Turks, was supported above all by the Wahhabi clergy, who thus hoped for the re-establishment of the theocracy and return to their old power. Ibn Saud still had one antagonist left, the Hashemite ruler Hussein bin Ali, who, as proconsul for the Turks, administered the holy sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. In 1918, after the overthrow of the Sultan, Ibn Saud attacked. His Ikhwan troops committed such atrocious massacres that Mecca surrendered without a fight, and Medina fell after a cruel siege. The unification of the country by sword was completed, the green flag of the Prophet waving everywhere.
Wahhabism arose in the 18th century in Desert Arabia. It was one of several movements, how shall I put it, of reaction and response to the growing power of the Western world. Unlike the others, it was not primarily anti-Western. The diagnosis of Ibn Abdul Wahhab was something like this: we have fallen behind, we have become poor and backward because we have abandoned the true faith. We have begun to imitate the ways of the infidels and follow wrong paths. So whereas the reformist movements said more modernization, the Wahhabis said what modernization, which is really westernization, is the source of all our problems. And they wanted to go back to the past, which of course means an imaginary past, not the real past.
To be in control of Mecca was important for Ibn Saud. Now he could pose worldwide as the custodian of Islam, and the hundreds and thousands of pilgrims filled the treasury with money. Thus he had himself crowned King of Saudi Arabia in 1932.
The House of Saud came from the district of Najd, Desert Arabia, remote and without much impact on anyone. But in the mid-20s, they were able to seize the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and create what came to be known as the Saudi Kingdom. As custodians of the holy places, this gave them tremendous influence and prestige all over the Muslim world. It also gave them control of the pilgrimage, which brings millions of Muslims from all over the Muslim world to the holy cities every year, same time, same place.
The income from the pilgrims supplemented the revenues which the country earned from the export of dates and of pearls, which divers fished out of the Persian Gulf. But after the invention of cultured pearls, the price for pearls suddenly dropped, and due to the world economic crisis, the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage, was reduced to a trickle. Mecca was deserted, Ibn Saud was now a poor man. He could not even pay the salaries of state employees anymore. Salvation came not from Allah, but from Standard Oil. On the 29th of May 1933, the Minister of Finance, Abdullah Suleiman, and Standard Oil's legal advisor, Lloyd Hamilton, signed a contract over the first oil concession. Because of religious objections against the exploitation of Arabian natural resources by foreigners and infidels, the king had asked the ulama, the Wahhabi Council of Senior Religious Scholars, to issue a fatwa, a judgment in accordance with the Quran, which said, as oil is a present from Allah, if produced by foreigners for the well-being of the country, this is permitted. A few years later, the present began to bubble. In April 1939, Ibn Saud, driving in a procession of 400 cars, came through the desert from Riyadh to Dhahran. In Dhahran, at the east coast, only a few kilometers away from the oil fields, an oil tank depot and a pipeline directly connected to the loading port, Ras Tunara, were built. The Standard Oil tanker D.J. Schofield was chosen to load the first oil cargo for export. The king insisted on being the one to personally open the oil valve for the fueling of the tanker. Today, a simple memorial with the inscription Prosperity Well reminds one of well number 7 from which the first oil flew. Prosperity Well, a self-conscious sign of wealth and power. Behind, around Dhahran, on the outskirts of Gawa, the largest oil field in the world, an oil dorado, spreads out on the Gulf Coast, with huge oil bunkers and the world's largest refinery.
The sudden flow of money beyond the wildest dreams of avarice. So you suddenly have this combination of a monarchy in possession of the holy cities, in control of the pilgrimage, and unlimited money, all of them at the disposal of the Wahhabis. This made Wahhabism a world force. It gave Wahhabism a tremendous impact wherever there are Muslims. And it made a world force of what otherwise would have been an extremist fringe in a marginal country.
From Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, it's only a short hop across the Gulf to Abadan in Persia, where it all began in 1908. It's still the largest oil center in Iran, even if its efficiency is not comparable to that of Dhahran. Reza Khan, a general of the Palace Guard who had proclaimed himself Shah in 1925, tried, like Ibn Saud, to unify and modernize the country. He built roads and created industries, and against the resistance of the Shiite mullahs, he improved the rights of women and abolished mandatory headscarf wearing. Other than Saudi Arabia, his country was dragged into the turmoil of World War II. As the Shah was in constant conflict with the British about their share in the oil revenues, he flirted with Hitler. After his invasion of Russia, London was not anymore opposed to the occupation of Iran by Russian troops. In late August of 1941, they jointly forced Reza Khan to resign, exiled him to South Africa, and proclaimed his youngest son his successor. In the parliament, formerly existent since 1906, the young Shah took his oath of office. Otherwise, he was confined without any powers to his palaces, as the occupation forces restricted his freedom of action. Stalin enjoyed some popularity in the poor country. Due to American pressure, he all the same agreed to withdraw his troops from northern Iran at the beginning of the Cold War in 1946. In Tehran, they were bid farewell in a friendly manner by the population. What remained was a strong communist party, the Tudeh Party, which fought against the British oil lords, the Americans, the landowners, and against the mullahs, whose influence under the weak Shah was once again growing. Elected in 1951 for the National Front Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh was also dependent on the Tudeh party. His aim was to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and to end British influence in Iran.
During this time, the oil companies controlled various ministries and even had influence at the court of the Shah. Thus, they virtually held all political power in Iran.
Dr.
Mossadegh fought with all his might for the independence of his country. He was especially concerned about the oil, but just as important to him was the independence of the Iranian people, so that they would be able to achieve their political and economic goals.
Oil again poses a threat to peace, and the Middle East again becomes a trouble spot.
Directly after the nationalization, which was reluctantly also signed by the Shah, hatred against the Anglo-Iranian and the British broke out and turned into rejoicing and wild demonstrations, especially in Abadan and Tehran. The Iranian flag was hoisted over buildings belonging to the English.
In Abadan's 125 degrees of heat, the international situation is explosive.
Mossadegh, a Western-educated owner of large estates, but also a fervent nationalist, was now popular. Mossadegh greets the Shah after a hospital stay. He only indicates a bow, and the handshake is cool on both sides. The Americans viewed Old Mossy not without sympathy. For fear of a British military operation in Iran, President Truman insisted on a mediation attempt, even though he called the head of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Sir William Fraser, a typical colonial slave driver from the 19th century. The hatred for the English led to more and more demonstrations, especially in Abadan. The tension escalated. The American ambassador delivered a letter by President Truman to Mossadegh in which he announced the arrival of his special emissary, Avril Harriman. Mossadegh, as often before, received his visitor in pyjamas, lying in bed, allegedly because of his tendency to bouts of dizziness. Upon Harriman's arrival, the atmosphere was tense and hostile. During further demonstrations by the illegal communist Tudeh party, which were also aimed against the Shah, 10 dead were reported. For the first time, mounted police were deployed. After weeks of negotiations, Harriman gave up. Mossadegh was not asking for higher stakes from the Anglo-Persian oil revenues, but as he feared for his power, he insisted on nationalization. On September the 25th, 1951, Mossadegh gave the British 1 week to vacate the facilities in Abadan. Thereupon the British shut off the oil supplies and threatened foreign tankers with legal steps in case they attempted to ship stolen oil. The British exodus began. While women, children and sick were allowed to fly out, the others gathered on the 4th of October at the Gymkhana Club, the centre of the English community, to close ranks and board the English cruiser Mauritius, which was to bring them to safety to Basra. While the ship left the harbour, the band defiantly played the River Kwai March. With this gesture, the 50-year-long British history in the Gulf came to an end. It symbolized the downfall of Britain's reputation and power in the world. But Mossadegh was in no situation to celebrate his success. The embargo imposed by Great Britain was showing results. The Abadan refinery stood still, the country on the verge of an economic collapse.
به من پدرم روزی
Every day my father gave me 1 Persian rial as pocket money.
پولا رو جمع کرده بودم.
I saved the money to buy large banners, together with other children from the neighborhood who, like myself, were school children.
روی اینا شعار نوشته بودیم.
On them, we wrote slogans for Mossadegh and against the British and their oil companies. Then we hung them up around the city.
اینا رو پخش می‌کردیم توی شهر با تیم دوستام.
Mossadegh now wanted all power for himself and mobilized the masses against the Shah. During a demonstration in Tehran, the equestrian statue of Reza Khan, the father of the Shah, was toppled off its pedestal. Ol Mossi had gotten wind of the Shah's plans to overthrow him and was now working on his expulsion. The situation became threatening for the Shah and the Empress. They decided to temporarily leave the country and stay in the Roman Hotel Excelsior. In the meantime, the Soviet diplomat Silin, who in 1948 in Prague had helped the communists come to power, had been appointed ambassador in Tehran, and Mossadegh relied even more on the Tudeh party. The new American President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Dulles already saw all of the Mideast fall under Soviet influence. There was only one solution: Mossadegh had to be overthrown. Head of CIA Allen Dulles, the brother of the Secretary of State, was assigned Operation Ajax, to which London had agreed. Mossadegh was to be replaced by a general loyal to the Shah. The tide changed within a few days. Now the masses demonstrated for the Shah, stirred up by the army, which stormed Mossadegh's villa. Ol Mossi could only escape by jumping across the garden fence. As planned, General Sahidi, head of the army and loyal to the Shah, took over command and distributed copies of the letter of dismissal for Mossadegh to journalists. The next morning in Rome, the Shah boarded a plane and returned to Tehran. In the meantime, Mossadegh had been arrested at his country estate. A court sentenced him to 3 years in prison. After he served his term, he was placed under lifelong house arrest.
آدم خیلی صادقی بود. اصطلاح آدم خیلی پاکی بود.
He was an honest man, a great democrat. And during his government we achieved a maximum of democracy, justice and independence. The more time goes by, the more students and young people realize that during this period we were having the best time of our lives.
In his diary, President Eisenhower wrote about the CIA's success. The Operation Ajax seemed more like a dime novel than a historical fact. The Shah had come out of the crisis more self-confident and with the will to consolidate his power, which was to be reflected in his coronation. He also didn't want the British back. The oil and the facilities remained in national possession. But for management and distribution, he needed a new partner. The Americans seized the opportunity. Under their leadership, they formed a consortium made up of 7 Western oil companies, among them 4 American and the British Anglo-Persian as a minority shareholder. From all revenues, the Shah received half. The oil from Abadan was flowing again. At the time, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was the most powerful man in the Mideast. He was an Arabian nationalist who hated Israel, the colonial powers and the oil companies. From the English and the French who operated the Suez Canal, he demanded payment of half of the fees. When both refused, he had the canal zone occupied and nationalized.
Mossadegh exerted great influence on the Mideast, among others on Abdul Nasser.
در مصر تأثیر زیادی از مصدق.
The nationalization of the Suez Canal and its recognition as Egyptian territory are a result of the ideas, the message, and the impact of Mossadegh.
The British and the French planned a military intervention. To ward this off, Nasser blocked the canal by sinking ships filled with stones and cement. In accordance with a joint war strategy, Israeli troops initially pushed forward through the Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal. London and Paris issued an ultimatum, asking Nasser to suspend all hostilities. When he did not respond, they began with their landing approach, at sea and from the air. They bombed Cairo and occupied the harbour town of Port Said. For England's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, Nasser was a second Hitler, whom one had to oppose with all one's might.
He has followed Hitler's pattern, even to concentration camps and the propagation of Mein Kampf among his officers. He has understood and used Goebbels' pattern of propaganda in all its lying ruthlessness.
In the meantime, the Arabs and the Saudis had stopped their oil shipments. In Europe, petrol became scarce, and the British, who since the downfall of their empire were basically bankrupt, ran out of money. Moreover, the English and French adventure in the Suez Canal took place at the same time as the brutal suppression of the uprising in Hungary by Soviet tanks. Therewith, they had morally discredited their intervention and provoked unfriendly comparisons on an international level, especially in the White House.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly.
After President Eisenhower refused to supply Paris and London with oil and money, the English and the French had no other option than to immediately withdraw and leave the reopening of the Suez Canal to the UN Blue Helmets, as initiated by Eisenhower. Great Britain's decline in the Mideast now also began to undermine its position in Iraq. Nasser's Pan-Arabian ideas strengthened the resistance against the pro-Western policy of the young King Faisal II. In the summer of 1956, after his coronation, he had been received by Queen Elizabeth during a state visit in London. He was regarded as London's most reliable ally in the region, who had also participated in the punitive action against Nasser. Influenced by Nasser, Egypt's free officers, initially a secret society within the army, were gaining more and more influence over the nationalistic masses. In July 1958, 2 years after Faisal's visit to London, the monarchy is overthrown and the king cruelly murdered. Marauding troops devastate the palace and also kill his son. Soon afterwards, they murder the pro-Western premier, Nouri al-Said. Shocked, the members of the English colony leave Baghdad. Some had witnessed the barbarian atrocities. The wife of an English officer describes what she saw and heard.
She said that the Crown Prince wasn't actually killed. He was only wounded. And he was immediately taken away and handed over to the mob to do what they wanted with.
And do you know what did happen?
Well, yes, they tore him to pieces, they mutilated his body, they cut his feet off, they cut his head off, his hands, and then they hanged him for everyone to see from the mosque in the main street in Baghdad.
Yes, the Arabs were delighted after the British had left the country. Their slogan was Naft al-Arab lil-Arab, which means Arabian oil for the Arabs The British themselves were to blame. They were too powerful and too arrogant. They couldn't tolerate any criticism.
Quickly, the rebellious officers occupy the state radio station in Baghdad. They hardly encounter resistance. The leader of the coup, General Abdul Qasim, speaks to the people in a radio address, which is also supposed to appease the audience abroad.
Our revolution is a real reaction against tyranny and corruption. Our foreign policy is to work for peace and cooperate with the other nations. Our oil policy has been declared. We will increase production and export to world markets.
What happened was when the monarchy was overthrown, what are the institutions that the British had brought to Iraq? They brought the monarchy, they brought parliament, and they built the army, and a modern Iraqi army. That army turned against its so-called creators, the British, and turned against the government that the British had installed. But it threw away, along with the monarchy, it threw away parliament. And we no longer have, we lost, the Iraqi parliamentary experience was terminated in 1958.
One of General Qasem's concerns was the Iraq Oil Company, which he began to nationalize. But he wanted access to even more oil. In June of 1961, he threatened to annex Kuwait. Military parades were supposed to illustrate his determination. Kuwait had never been a part of Iraq. For decades she had been a British protectorate and had just gained independence. Still, as a protecting power, London felt bound to her security commitments and increased her military presence. This deterred Qasem. Even though most of the Arab nations had no significant military power, they assured the Kuwaiti ruler, al-Sabah, of their support. They had money. Great Britain did not. She was going through another economic crisis and sought to solve her problems by devaluating the pound in 1967. The Labour government under Prime Minister Wilson hoped for an economic revival, to no avail. Wilson had no other choice but to give up the last position in the Mideast.
I made clear that following the evacuation of Aden, our defense planning will be based on the withdrawal of all our forces from our principal Far Eastern bases and from the Persian Gulf to take effect by the end of 1971. And if even with the strengthening of the industrial base which we are achieving, we can no longer afford the role of world policeman, equally we can no longer afford the role of world banker.
Only 6,000 ground staff and a few flying squadrons were left in the Gulf. Matter of expense, annually £12 million. Too much for what was left of the empire. An offer by the United Arab Emirates to come up for the costs was rejected by London. Her soldiers were no mercenaries. In Iran, the Shah was already waiting to fill the power vacuum. Washington supported him. In the region, 58% of the world's certified oil reserves were to be found.
I think the Shah was a very clever person, very curious. I knew him from '62, and I used to see him several times every year, and we discussed things. And at the very end, when he was convinced by Kissinger that he will be the gendarme of the Gulf, he became a bit arrogant, and he continued. Saudi Arabia was opposing a sharp increases in the price of oil, but he was convinced that with a sharp increase in the price of oil, he will make enough money to buy weapons.
The Shah loved to hold military parades, to demonstrate the power of his army and to show his weapons. He was one of the best customers of the American arms industry. In Tehran, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger promised the Shah extensive weapon supplies. even though they knew that he had built up a despotic regime.
The discovery of oil in the Middle East has been not a blessing, but a curse for those countries. You know, there is a saying, which is often repeated in the United States, no taxation without representation, meaning that in order to levy taxes, you have to permit some kind of elected assembly to obtain the cooperation of the people in levying and collecting taxes. No taxation without representation. Unfortunately, the oil countries of the Middle East have demonstrated that the converse is also true. No representation without taxation. Since these governments have plenty of oil money, they don't need to collect taxes from their people. They therefore don't need to pay any attention to the goodwill of their people. They can ill-treat them and suppress them and brutalize them as much as they wish. They have no need of popular support. They have therefore no need of popular assemblies of any kind. And in this respect, I would say that the discovery of oil and the commercial exploitation of oil has been a disaster for the region as a whole, in that it has enormously strengthened the power of the ruler, whatever kind of ruler it might be.
It was one of the largest parties in history. In October 1971, the Shah issued invitations to join the festivities in the ancient city of Persepolis, marking the foundation of the first Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great 2,500 years previously. Kings, presidents and heads of state from 69 countries were invited. The celebration banquet was delivered by Maxime de Paris. The whole party cost $200 million. The show included a parade of floats with historical figures dressed in costumes from the time of the great Persian dynasties to the time of the Shah's father. At the alleged grave of Cyrus, the Shah took a theatrical oath. "O Cyrus, great king, king of kings, I, the Shah-in-Shah of Iran, will continue your work." In his megalomania, he had totally distanced himself from his people. 8 years later, the Shah-in-Shah was driven out of the country.
Next week is Testing and Exams Week. Discover how a leading school uses subtle revision techniques to help children do their best in the Key Stage 2 national curriculum tests. We investigate why cheating is on the increase and what can be done about it. For all our videos and resources, go to teachers.tv/assessment.